So, yeah. It is down all the way, and I just went to tell Dale we're like manufacturing heat in here.
Linda, I turned it down 20 minutes.
Good morning.
Yeah, I think it's actually putting out hot air.
It is. When I touched it.
So hopefully something's going to happen. We may have a columbarium class here in a minute. Take up our bed and walk.
Yes.
With that. As we begin today, Norman has a thank you card that's come to us that he would like to read.
This is a sympathy, acknowledgement of sympathy.
Ollie's taking charge.
We cannot thank you enough for the prayers which we have certainly felt, and the delicious food that was delivered to our door, and the beautiful reception that was provided for us after the service for Paul. Thank you for your loving kindness. Paul enjoyed Mark's teaching and the fellowship so very much. Our love, Paula, Jane, and Sue.
Good.
It's from the Alloway family.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, that's bad.
So, thank you for reading that, Norman. Thank you for that. By the way, in the realm of announcements, today Jordan Schollhorn is being dedicated at the 11 o'clock service. And
I want to know how George did the triplet.
well, their mothers helped. Yeah, so everyone had a kid.
This morning was morning service.
I
It was
almost
really
got up
lovely.
early
See,
just to
you
see.
shortchanged.
I'm
I saw
glad
you
it
do
was.
it one at a time.
Yeah, no, those girls are cute.
Man, if you don't know that they're triplets, though, you're walking into church. I thought I had lost my mind. They're three.
Three of
How
the
old
same
are
kids.
they about? I've forgotten.
They're almost 2.
Okay, I thought they were bigger than babies.
Yeah, they were born severely prematurely.
Oh, yeah.
And so we're in the NICU, and then they've had to catch up on everything, and so today is their first day at church.
Okay.
Almost 2.
How's baby Andrew?
Baby Andrew is doing well. This is Andrew Rose, and yeah, it still has a tube in, but they're able to get out, like to go to the store and do some stuff. Yeah, very good. Hopefully this temperature will resolve in a minute. I apologize. We seem to be snake bit in this room of late. My goodness. Well, a number of prayer concerns we'll get to at the end, but I do want you to know, just by way of Susan Leonard is in a hospital.
Yeah.
I think most of you are aware that she fractured her pelvis. We'll talk about that more. But she said the Wilshire grapevine has really worked well, and she's had a lot of contacts from folks. Very good. Okay, well, I think we saw some folks out for spring break, even if they don't have a kid in school. So either that or they don't like the Terribles anymore. I don't know. Which is it? So next Sunday I'll be gone. We're leaving on vacation this week. I was supposed to be gone the entire month of March and part of February on sabbatical, which we've postponed, but we're taking a week of vacation. And Allison and I will be in Santa Fe for a week, trying to regroup, and looking forward to that. But you have an improvement for next week, because you always want to improve. You want to go up with your substitutes, not down. Some people want to go down so they'll look better. I want to go up, and so
We have nowhere to go but up. So.
nowhere to go. Spoken by the counselor. Yeah, Jacob Topper will be teaching next
Oh,
week.
good.
So, yeah. See, I told you, it's an upgrade. Absolutely. With that.
Can you tell us the new
the new interns that are coming in, or is that still a secret for a
I
while?
can tell you when the camera's off,
Oh, great, thank you.
because it's not been publicly
Oh,
announced where they
right,
are.
okay, thank you.
Yes. But remind me at prayer time, and I will tell you the answer to that question. Yeah.
Are you still in pain?
Yes.
So are you taking?
Medication.
So you are still taking medication?
Yes.
Are you driving?
Okay. I will say I was surprised. I didn't realize how much pain you were in.
Yeah. So pain's not really the right word. It's severe discomfort is probably, and I know a lot of y'all live with severe discomfort too. So I don't want to take away your moment either with that. But the medication I'm on is not sedating. So yeah, I'm able to drive. I'm trying to adjust that medication right now, and I'm a little bit crazy today because of it. So anyhow, okay. Well, I'll miss you next week. But again, you're in good hands with Jacob, and my gosh, it's so hot in here, I may pass out.
Teach behind the table,
Yeah.
it's cooler.
And my curls are gonna get frizzy too.
Yeah, mine too.
It's all about me.
Man. Okay, so today we're on a parable that is only found in Matthew's Gospel. It's only the one place, and there are some similarities to some other parables, but it stands on its own as well. So this is from Matthew chapter 13. Now, if you're wondering, why have we excerpted, and why have I cut out part of Matthew 13, is because the way this is structured, if you look at all of it, is that Jesus tells this parable, and then he tells two other parables before he interprets the first parable. And it is rare, as we said, in the Gospels, for Jesus to interpret a parable. Most of them are sort of laid out there for us to figure out on our own. And I didn't want to get into those two other parables because that's next week's lesson. So I didn't want to steal Jacob's thunder on that. Plus, we got plenty to talk about on this one because this is considered one of the most difficult parables of Jesus to figure out, even though we're given an interpretation. Because there are some people, a lot of people, who think the interpretation doesn't match the parable. All right? So who would volunteer to be our reader for today?
I'll read.
All right.
The whole thing on.
Yeah, read the whole thing.
Okay. He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and they went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? He answered, An enemy has done this. The slaves have said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he replied, No, for in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until a harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, Collect the weeds first, and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. Then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples approached him, saying, Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field. He answered, The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seeds are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anyone with ears listen.
Woo, pretty stout. Right? The writer, the famous writer, journalist of a day gone by, H.L. Mencken, once said that for every complex problem, there is an answer that is neat, plausible, and wrong. Let me say that again. For every complex problem, there's an answer that is neat, plausible, and wrong. And I think we can see that play out all around us, right? You get a complex problem and someone says, oh, well, the answer is easy. And they tell you their answer, and you think, okay, well, that sounds good. But maybe it's not actually right. And this parable sort of fits that mold because it is very easy to say, well, the answer's given. Don't you believe what it says? Let me ask, as we begin, how have you heard this parable taught before or preached? Do you have a memory of it?
No.
It's most famously known as the wheat and the tares.
Oh, well, that I've heard
The
before.
wheat and the tares. Right?
Right, I guess, yes.
Anyone?
I recognize the wheat from gnashing of teeth.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's,
The one that I'm the most familiar with is the one where there's the different kinds, the seeds fall in different places.
That was last week.
Yeah, okay. We were out of town.
I know.
Anyway, so I don't think I've ever heard this one.
You're forgiven. It's all right.
I'm the one that we're, sorry.
Yep.
Dedication day. Okay, I'm trying to read. This is the one where the seeds get planted and they come up with
The weeds and
come up and they say to wait, let them grow up.
Right.
And you're asking how were we taught this?
Yeah.
The one thing that stands out to me is that good and evil will always exist in the world together, and you can't necessarily eradicate the evil without pulling up some of the good as well. So let's
Yeah.
be patient, and then we can separate when things have matured and when kind of when the dust is
All
settled.
right, that's it. We can go home now. That's I mean, this is, yeah, that's it. That's good.
I wonder if there's a key to why the evil had to be pulled out first. Like
Well-
when they let them grow together, then they were specifically instructed to pull the weeds
Yeah,
out
and
first.
we're going to talk about that thing too. Oh, there is something we need to talk about. That's that. Yeah. So when I was a kid growing up in a fundamentalist Baptist church in Oklahoma, there was a pastor at a nearby church to us, First Southern Baptist Church of Del City, Oklahoma. All right, and the pastor there was a guy, an evangelist named Bailey Smith. And Bailey Smith, you may recall, was president of the Southern Baptist Convention early in the fundamentalist takeover, and he's the one who famously said, "God will not hear the prayers of a Jew." And it made all the national media, and so that's the world from which I come, y'all. All right? So Bailey Smith was a super evangelist kind of person. It was a very evangelical, evangelistic church, and he, in those days, went out and did revival meetings everywhere. And he had a very famous sermon that he preached all over the place on the wheat and the tares. The wheat and the tares. And this was, he was very famous for getting church people to get saved. All right? He was very famous for getting church people to get saved. Usually pastors, spouses of pastors, deacons, spouses of deacons, Sunday school teachers, because part of his shtick was getting you to doubt your salvation.
Yeah.
To make sure that you know, that you know, that you know, that you know. Boom. So one of the reasons I was baptized a second time was because Bailey Smith came to our church and preached a revival meeting. And
Well, I had a high school friend who was in First Baptist Church, Huntsville, Alabama. And Bailey Smith came there for a revival. This was, of course, 30, 40 years ago. And so Steve and his wife had them into their home for fellowship. You'd have to know Steve to understand this, but he says, "Bailey, I really need to talk to you about whether or not you're really a Christian. But, I need to question you about that, your salvation."
yeah. And so
Turn the tables.
If you look at this parable carefully, you can see how someone could get there, because the idea of the Bailey Smith sermon, as I recall it, was that the church is full of wheat and tares. So a tare is a wheat, T-A-R-E. By the way, just a little description on that. Stop that. The word in Greek is zizania, as it's transliterated, which means tares or darnel, D-A-R-N-E-L. Any farmers in the class? Okay, I didn't think so. So it's probably, and here's the Latin word, Pat, Lolium timulentum.
What now?
Lolium timulentum is an annoying weed. Aren't all
It's an
weeds
annoying word.
It's an annoying weed that looks very much like wheat,
Oh,
especially before maturity, and can carry a poisonous fungus that can poison the entire crop.
Since I grew up on a farm, I didn't brew wheat.
Okay, that's exactly what they think this is.
Grass has,
If it is harvested and ground together with wheat, the resulting flour is spoiled.
oh.
So the wheat and the weed look the same until harvest time, right? And so the Bailey Smith sermon was, the church is full of wheat and tares. And you don't know the people around you who are really weeds and the people who are really good wheat. And you may think you're wheat, and you could really be a weed unless you know that you know that you know that you know that you know, and you could, right? Doyle?
To me, it seems as if God is the one who caused us all of this problem, because he's the one who sent the evil one to go sow the weed. Because the person who planted good seeds on it, and then he sent somebody to go plant the weed. And now it becomes our problem.
All right, so Darrell is saying this is all God's fault. Because, to quote Darrell, God sent the evil one to go plant the seed. Why do we think God sent the evil one?
I don't know, that's why I'm asking.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a great question.
What she said?
That's why she's asking. Yeah, setting me up here. So this parable is a classic example of the question of theodicy. And theodicy is a big word that means, why do bad things happen to good people? Right? Why is there evil and suffering in the world? Why does God allow this to happen? Right? And why does God allow weeds to be sown among the good harvest, regardless of who you think this is? So, first of all, before I answer the question, you can read this parable in different ways, and one of the first questions you've got to ask is this a parable told to the church? Is it a parable told to the individuals who are hearing it about themselves? Is it a parable told to the Jewish people about the state of them? How do we read the context of this? And my answer to that is it's probably all of those things. I think because it's a parable, it has the ability to be applied multiple ways. It is a truth that transcends setting, right? So hopefully we can find some universal truth in this. Before we get too far afield, on this question of where does the evil come from, one of the answers I like to propose is that sometimes we can be both the good and the bad seed together. And as evidence of that, look at the interpretation that Jesus gives in verse 41, toward the end here. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun. So if you think about God stripping away all causes of sin, not just all sinners, that implies that some of us who are infected, and isn't that all of us? Some of us who are infected with sin can be delivered of the causes of sin. That's a different way to think about this. Now, anyone in here seen the box office smash movie Black Panther? All right? I know most of y'all are probably Marvel Comics fans. I knew Chad probably would have seen it, right? So Black Panther is all the rage right now.
Yeah.
It is a Marvel Comics movie. We saw it Friday night, and it's just an outstanding movie. Really,
Lots of violence, though.
lots of violence, lots of profanity. So if you're offended by that, don't go. And if you don't like action movies, don't go. If you don't like superhero movies, don't go.
If you're only going to see Sterling Brown,
Is there a reason to go?
Well, so here's the deal. There's a storyline in this movie that's relevant to our conversation today. And what happens here is this is imaginary, remember, so it's like a parable. There's a kingdom where the king has a nephew who does some bad things, and the king, a la King David, actually in a fit of rage kills the nephew and then covers it up. Unfortunately, in the cover-up, he leaves behind the nephew's son, who then grows up from elementary age to adulthood with a whole lot of anger issues in this mythical world. And toward the end of as the movie progresses, there ends up being a cosmic confrontation between that child grown up, who's really turned into an aggressive warrior type, and the king's son, who's now king, right? They are battle of good and evil in a way. But the problem is the evil guy here is much more sympathetic to us than, say, Darth Vader. Right? We don't have a lot of sympathy for Darth Vader, or we probably should in Star Wars. But this guy, and there's this lovely line where the king's son, who's now the king, is trying to say to people that they need to figure this out, and he says of his, see if this is his, what would his
cousin.
That'd be his cousin, right? He says of his cousin, "This is a problem of our own making." That was the best line in the whole movie, because what he's saying is, my father created this problem by his action and his lack of action. And now it's come home to roost with us, and we've got to own it and deal with it. And that made me think of this lesson and this parable. Is it possible that sometimes the weeds that are choking out the good seed among us are weeds that we have accidentally planted ourselves? Right? Can you think of a family situation or a work situation where you or someone else has accidentally planted some weeds? And it may not be a problem today, but a year, 5 years, 10 years down the road, that weed grows up and it becomes a huge problem to the good crop. And if you had known what was going to happen later, you would not have done what you did then. Anyone? Yeah? Know what I'm talking about? So before we rush off and say, well, Satan is sowing evil seeds, and I'm not saying Satan's not sowing evil seeds, but sometimes Satan has some help for some of us.
Lots of it.
Right?
Well, and I think, too, that it's not even so much as, it's more of just the things you cultivate. The seeds may have already been there and growing. It's you actually help them grow, you know? So the sins that come up in your life, even from the past, it's whether you cultivate them or not, you know, I think makes a big difference.
Yeah, Chad, I think that's a great, because often, particularly if you study family systems, we water the wrong things. And we're sometimes unwittingly watering the weeds and not the good seed. Right?
But isn't it true, I mean, I'm not very much into yard work or anything at all, but isn't it true that weeds grow without any care? And
That's
so
right.
that it's, like in this parable, the weeds would grow without, the seeds would have to be carefully sown to continue, and all the watering and everything to care for it to continue to grow, but the weeds are gonna grow anyway, so.
Yeah.
I mean, once they're planted, there's not anything, we don't necessarily cause it to continue to get worse. I mean,
Well, but if you water a weed, it will grow more.
Okay.
They're gonna get the same thing that the good.
That's right, because they're like this in the ground, right? Several years ago, I was trying to overseed part of my yard. We have a hard time growing grass because we have so much shade. And so I tried to overseed, and I think within the seed that I scattered, it was maybe not the highest quality seed, thank you Home Depot, that it should have been, and within it there was some other stuff. And that other stuff, man, it grows great. And it's not a weed, it's a grass, it's a different kind of grass, it's a different color. So I have like a two-tone yard, which I'm sure is going to be trendy someday.
Yeah.
You were ahead of your time.
Right. So when we get to this problem of why is there evil in the world, it's very easy for us to want to root out evil. I'm all about that myself, as long as it's someone else's evil. I can see your evil a lot better than I can see my own. I think that's true of most of us as well, right? So, given what we've talked about so far, let's take a little check-in. What are you thinking about the parable at this point? What are you hearing from it that has some relevance to you?
Well, Mark, the evil that we do may not come home to roost in our lifetime, just like him. It may have seeds way on down the line.
Yeah. Wow.
Well, look what happened with them.
Yeah.
I mean, the sons are paying for the evil of the father.
Yeah. Well, and just absolutely the clearest example we can see of this in American history is the evil of slavery.
Yeah.
And the people who perpetuated slavery are not here to see the third and fourth generation repercussions of that, right? Same thing happens with all types of abuse with people. Yeah, you can see this in alcoholism and other addictions as well, right?
Well, it gives me a little bit of pause or maybe a deep breath when I get worried about, all the evil and what's going on, and is today worse than 5 years ago or what have you. There's always been evil, and there will always be.
Yeah.
And although we do our best to weed it out or cultivate the good, in the end, God will separate. And it's not really up to, we do what we can, but not to get so caught up in that it just overtakes our lives, because in the end, it'll be taken care of.
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent point, right? Part of the lesson today is that God is in charge and we're not. God is the gardener, ultimately. We're not, right? Mike?
I got one.
I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I would have to say, I think we have to be careful what you're saying, because we have responsibilities to make proper decisions. And most of these things can be traced back to bad decisions. And we do that today. And,
Right.
to me, that fosters the evil right there, the bad decisions do.
Yeah, and before I get to your comment, Mike, I think this is absolutely right. There are multiple times I've thought to myself, if I could get in a time machine and go back X number of years and keep this one thing from happening, we would not have this problem today.
But how much learning do you miss in between point A and B? And I'm not saying you should go around and just make bad decisions or not think about what we are doing today, how that's going to affect us tomorrow, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. I think for me, it just helps me not completely lose hope.
Yeah, those of us who want to be fixers want to go back in time and fix things. And so you're both right. Yes.
I'm seeing this one on, I guess, on a different level. So when I first see it, I'm hearing Jesus say that admission to the kingdom or whatever is conditional. Some are making it, some aren't. I roll that forward and I'll say after the atonement, salvation is forgiveness of everything, union with God. is it still conditional? Or is it universal? And so I do hear, and we'll just say, my brother was in a very I will say an evangelical type of church. It was only through that way that
Right.
you would be admitted. I hear other aspects more accepting, more open, but rarely do I ever hear unconditional. You've been saved. We're talking about sin and stuff like that, and I understand that on a worldly basis. But ultimately, what does it mean? Is it universal? Is it no matter what?
So great question. So if you are a universalist, so someone who believes that at the end everybody's going to be saved. Hello, Jordan. If that's your belief, you might read this parable as saying at the end there's a cleansing of all that is evil, and God redeems everyone through that, right? And I think that's a fair reading of this, particularly given verse 41 that I pointed out earlier, that God cleanses all evil. I think there's also an intermediate way that allows you to get to my belief. Of course there's got to be a way to get to my belief. I'll make a way, right?
That's fair.
And that is back to the idea that those who are separated from God are those who willfully separate themselves from God.
Yeah.
And the cleansing that comes has the power to cleanse all who are willing to be cleansed. And that if we choose not to, if we actively reject that throughout time, then that is the decision. It's not God's decision, it's our decision, right? That's where I personally come down. Now, the other side of this, the Bailey Smith side that I was talking about at the beginning, is there are people who are in and there are people who are out, and you darn well better know which group you're in, right? And then the hyper-Calvinistic view is God has chosen some people to be in and some people to be out, right? So there's a whole gradation along here. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
No, I get
see
your
it.
question? Yeah.
Back to the devil, just one.
Yeah.
So the devil's here. Then you
Where?
would everywhere.
I want to know who.
So
I'm
back to
sitting
yours. You could be misled by the devil,
Yes.
and still be admitted. But if that's just your basic belief, you would say that no, you've made that choice. And you're out.
And that gets to the question: are there truly evil people in the world?
I think so.
And I think all of us who've lived long enough know that.
Yeah.
Well,
Make a pretty good case for that.
Then
right?
back to this: is sin a behavior? Is it a thing, or is it more? So is the devil incarnate type of thing? That's a thing. But sin, sinful behavior is what we normally discuss. So when he's cleansing, is he saying a thing, a behavior?
So I've got to think
what
that
what is the thoughts on that?
The cleansing atonement, back to your idea, the atonement is good to change who people are, right? Not just what they do. What they do follows from who they are, right? And I think the power of the gospel has the strength to change the very nature of who someone is, right? So here's an example. Another fascinating bit of news this week. I hope you saw this. Did anyone read the story about the astronaut twins, the Kelly brothers?
Yes.
Yeah. Did you see this one, Pat? This is
Yeah.
fascinating. Okay.
DNA.
So they are identical twins with identical genes before they both went to space. And one of them lived in space on the International Space Station for a year. They kept his brother here on Earth as a control subject. And what they found out afterward is that 2 years later, some percentage, some
Like around 7 or 8.
7%.
7 or 8% of the astronaut who went to space, his genes are different than his brother's now. They've been changed. Something in living in space changed his DNA.
That's another reason I don't want to go out there.
Yeah, and it had a number of effects. So I tell you that story to say, I think what happens through the saving work of Jesus in our lives is that we are changed from the inside out. That God has the power to change the heart from within and take an evil person and redeem them from the inside. I've got to believe that. It's hard work, and not every person is willing to be changed. Because God will not come inside you and change you if you resist, right? Ultimately. And herein lies the problem of harvesting the weeds along with the good seed too early. There's a way to control weeds and not let them overtake the crop. And that's Mike's point. There's also a need to give time for change to happen. And I'm not saying weeds turn into good seeds, necessarily. Although I'd like to think that, right?
DNA can be changed.
DNA can be changed, we now know. Send the plant to space. But if we really believe in the power of redemption, but at the same time, evil cannot be allowed to triumph even in the short term. There is a sense that God is setting all things right, and at the end of time, God will have the harvest, and righteousness will be the product of that. We do have a responsibility as gardeners along the way, and that's really what we are as humans. We are caretakers of God's good creation. That's the role that's given to Adam and Eve that we've inherited. We are caretakers of God's creation, which, by the way, is a good reason to be concerned about the environment, because we are caretakers of God's creation. It's not that God has put us here to use up everything and waste it, right? God has put us here to tend to the earth and take it, because the earth is part of God's creation as well. God created it all. That's my side note to that. All right? Where are we? Now, here's the problem with when we talk about God's sovereignty, and you say, well, if God is sovereign and in control of all of the world, all the universe, all that is, why doesn't God just pluck out the weeds and give us a good crop? That's a good question. Right? God has the capacity.
Okay, but would that negate our free will?
Yes.
Then
But,
what?
but aren't you willing to give up a little bit to have a better life?
Man, you're talking to a control for, I don't know, like, yeah, I mean, if that's the way it was to be, then that's the way it would be. There are some questions that we just have to be okay that we won't have the answers to.
Right.
That's why we keep reading, we keep, right? Like,
So the parallel for us as Americans is we love our democracy. We love the freedom of conscience that we have. Studies over and over show that people are willing to trade away certain amounts of that in order to feel safe. Right? Whatever the issue is, a lot of times we get so afraid, we're willing to trade off some part of our freedom in order to feel safer about things, right? So imagine, what would people really like it? I'm quoting, I've had a good time quoting Weeks now, so I've got one now. Would people really like it if God were to rule the world directly and immediately, so that our every thought and action were weighed and instantly judged, and if necessary punished, in the scales of God's absolute holiness? If the price of God stepping in and stopping a campaign of genocide were that God would also have to rebuke and restrain every other evil impulse, including those we all still know and cherish within ourselves, would we be prepared to pay that price? No. I think we know the answer in ourselves is no. Right? And that's what it would take.
But there are those that would be willing to do that, Mark.
There are those
In
who
our
would.
society. there
Right.
are those.
And, I mean, this is the very heart of the gun debate we're having right now. Where on the sliding scale is the spot that we as a people are willing to be between safety and individual rights, right? You can see it played out in that very conversation. But apply, whatever your opinion is on that, take your position, ask the question with a different set of circumstances, and you may find yourself in a different place, right? Yeah. The wheat and the tares are growing up together, and so we can focus on why are there weeds there, and that's okay. We can ask that question. We may focus on what do we do with the weeds once we know they're there. That's also a fair question. We may focus on what is God going to do at the end of time to separate the wheat from the tares, and that's also a good question. So multiple ways you could take this lesson. Now, let's see what I need to. Okay. I would also say this is the problem with being a single issue voter of any kind. When you go to the ballot box and you are driven by one issue alone, whatever that issue is, left or right, center, whatever, if you only go through the filter of that one issue, you are of necessity going to end up with some weeds in your wheat. And you got to know that you're making that choice because the very decisions you make may come back to bite you as well.
But Mark, from the other perspective, even if you aren't a one-issue voter, either way you vote, you're going to end up with some weeds in your
That's
wheat
true.
because there's not. I mean,
Yeah.
neither side has all the.
Ideally, if you could pick and choose,
You can minimize the weeds.
you can minimize the weeds. Thank you, Mike.
Minimize them.
Yeah, a little
Be
weed
smart,
control.
minimize it.
Yeah. Now, here's another Tom Wright quote. We who live after Calvary and Easter know that God did indeed act suddenly and dramatically, and at that moment on Calvary. When today we long for God to act, put the world to rights, we must remind ourselves that God has already done so, and that what we are now awaiting is the full outworking of those events. We wait with patience, not like people in early morning who know that sun has arisen and are now waiting for the full brightness of, like. So this is a reference to verse 43, when the righteousness will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. And Tom Wright goes on to say, for us here, when we think of the brightness of sunrise or sunset, it's a beautiful thing. And we think of the beauty of the sky and all that. In the Middle East, it's a little bit different because the conditions are so harsh there that the sunrise is a glaring, burning thing. So the original hearers of Jesus would have heard the sunrise as an entirely different idea, one of gamma rays coming at you, really a different thing than we were. Does that make sense? All right, let's move along here. We talked about where do these weeds come from, the origin of evil, and we talked about is evil part of God's plan as well. Now, one other commentator I read said this: the purpose of this parable is not to resolve the debates on theodicy, the problem of evil and suffering, but to demystify evil in the experience of the listeners and readers. The point of this parable is not philosophical, but ethical. The question is, what should be done in the face of the presence of evil in the world? Not why is there evil in the world, but what should we do knowing there is evil in the world? Ethics is the point of the servant's question, this person says. Let's talk about that for just a moment. it's very easy for us to fixate on why. Why did this happen? Why is there evil? Why has God allowed this? Where is God? But what if we stopped and laid that aside and said, knowing there's evil in the world, how are we to respond? How are we to act? Anyone?
We just have to do what's within our realm to fight the evil in our circles. We can't fix it all, but everybody can do something to. So I think it's our job to do what we can to fight the evil that we are able to fight or to fight.
Right. Sometimes we can get so discouraged by the prevalence of evil around us that we don't do anything. We become paralyzed, right? Carol Ann?
I was going to say, and sometimes it's just as simple as giving a glass of cold water in Jesus' name with a smile. I watched a person walking down our street in Garland, and I thought, I am so blessed, because this person was homeless and carrying all their goods, down the street. And I thought, we are so blessed. And just a cup of water or some food.
Yeah. When we get blinded by the big problems that we can't solve, we might lose the ability to handle the small problems that we can't solve, right? And I think this is good advice for us always, particularly as life presents us challenges. It's very easy for any of us to get caught in the why trap. Why has this happened to me? Why is this going on? Why has God allowed this to happen? And I think those of you who've been down that road know that there's no productive answer to that question. Linda?
What's difficult in today's society is the definition of evil itself, because what one person might think is really evil, somebody else might think is okay. And even if you go to the Bible, it's still not always completely, there's still people take sides about that.
Yeah.
So deciding what God wants you to stand up for and what might, you just have to say, I don't know, that's hard.
So I'm going to turn the Bailey Smith sermon of your into a different application today. And I want to say, not only are there weeds growing up in the pews of the church, there's some weeds growing up in the pulpits of the church as well. And there are some folks out there today who are going to have tremendous accountability for the twisting of the Word of God that they have done and are doing. I mean, contortions worthy of an Olympic gymnast, right? To get to somewhere they're going. Sadly, that's always been the case. We see it in different generations. It makes the issues different.
Mark, on Facebook a few days ago after Billy Graham's funeral, there was two houses. One was just a nice colonial house. Did you see it? And this was a pastor's house, And then it showed Joel Osteen's house. And it said, is this a pastor's house?
Yeah, it was Joel Osteen's house and Billy Graham's house next to each other.
Yeah. I mean, there was such a difference in it that it was really ridiculous.
I rest my case on that. Okay, let me end with this. Know that the kingdom of God is present among us, even though judgment may not appear to be taking place right now. The ministry of Jesus and the work of the Spirit is happening whether we see it or not. The presence of evil is no evidence that the kingdom is not at work. Second, even though this is not the time for ultimate judgment, that time will come. And the parable that Jesus teaches instructs us that the day of judgment will come. This is a parable with a warning to us, a warning to change our behavior. But it's also a parable with of encouragement, because if you look at verse 43, then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. And the parable interpretation ends with Jesus saying, let anyone with ears listen. And Jesus tells the parable for the sake of helping people change. Not for the To make a U-turn, as the children's sermon says today. To make a U-turn, right? That's what repentance is. And Matt gives us that in the children's sermon today as well. So rather than being discouraged by this, we should be encouraged that we have the opportunity to be part of God's harvest by making wise decisions and being about justice and righteousness and holiness where we can. Anyone with the last thought on that?
I have a thought. I know I've had a lot of them today, but this parable is pretty because one thing that kind of confuses me, but I think it's kind of weird telling you, and the way it's worded, it sounds like that the good or I'm not sure the word used, but anyway, then they will shine after the evil is removed. Where the other things like talking about being a city on the hill or not hiding your candle, we should be shining now. But this parable makes it sound we're not gonna be evidence until the evil is removed.
So here's the way I read it, and maybe I'm just being too Pollyanna here. I read it as saying that when the cover of evil is removed from us, we have the potential to shine in righteousness. That the righteousness is there, it just may not be seen as clearly right now. That's my hope. Yeah. Okay, well that's the end of our lesson today. Let's talk about our prayer concerns.